In this lesson, we're going to introduce the Spring MVC framework. We will discuss the features of the framework and talk about how they provide value to developers. Let's talk more about Spring MVC. Spring MVC is Spring's web framework. When you're building a web application, you can choose to use Spring's web framework. Now, the developers at Spring used the model view controller principle when building the Spring MVC framework. That means we're going to get all of the benefits that are associated with the MVC pattern. We're going to have separation of concerns amongst the model, the view, and the controller in the application. And that's going to grant us the flexibility and reusability of the different components and different layers within our application. We're also going to have a consistent architecture that we use across our web applications when using Spring MVC. All of the benefits that we experience from the MVC pattern are going to be present within Spring MVC. Another great characteristic of the Spring MVC framework is that it's built upon the Spring IOC container. Spring MVC has a dependency upon Spring Core. And we know that the Spring Core and the Spring IOC container allow us to perform dependency injection. Since Spring MVC is a Spring project, it integrates very well with other Spring projects. For example, if we wanted to use Spring Data or Spring's Hibernate integration or Spring Security within our Spring MVC project, it easily ties in because it's built by the same group of individuals and they have provided mechanisms to integrate the different projects together. It's very common to see Spring MVC used with Spring Data or Spring Security. Now I'd like to go into detail on two of the most beneficial aspects of the Spring framework. The one feature that I really like about the framework is its request processing lifecycle. When we talk about a web framework, we're talking about receiving requests and returning responses. Well, Spring does this by using the front controller pattern. Basically, we have a single point of entry, the front controller, that will receive requests from the web browser. Or it could be another service calling, our web application or hitting one of our endpoints. We'll discuss that at a later point. But let's just imagine we receive a request from a web browser, and that goes into our front controller. Now, what our front controller will do is it will analyze the URL in most cases, and the URLs will be mapped to a particular controller. Once it finds a controller that is assigned to handle the particular URL we received, it will then forward the processing over to the controller. And this is where the business logic takes place. And also a model is built. So remember, a model is going to hold all of the different objects that hold the data for our system. We build up this model, and then the controller returns the model as well as the view that it would need to have rendered. It sends that back to the front controller. The front controller locates that view and passes it the model. The view is then rendered and returned to the front controller, then it is returned as the response to the browser. That's the basic request processing lifecycle. And when using Spring MVC, you know that every request is going to be handled using this lifecycle. When we develop an application without an MVC framework, we're often using a servlet, hopefully, and that servlet may have your own custom framework built in. Maybe there's multiple servlets, maybe multiple team members are using different approaches. And if you're really unlucky, you'll see somebody doing all of this work within a JSP. Basically, it gets very unorganized. Spring really standardizes that approach and conforms all of your request processing to a familiar pattern that you can then establish. What's also neat about the request processing lifecycle is there are different points where you can add custom objects into the lifecycle. You can do things like manipulate the model. You can change how the front controller determines which controller is selected to handle a particular URL. You can control which view is displayed to the user, and you can customize data binding. We will introduce those more advanced topics throughout our work with Spring MVC. Now, one thing I just touched on is data binding, and I feel this is another very powerful aspect of Spring MVC. When a request is sent to a server, we have request parameters that normally get sent. For example, if we look at the Firebug excerpt on the left side of the screen, we see that a request was sent and it had 5 parameters: birth date, first name, last name, profile picture, and user ID. Here we're kind of sending a user's information over the wire to our server. Well, what Spring MVC is great about is taking those parameters, and these parameters are basically name-value pairs. The birth date being the name, and then 7-4-1776, our date, being the value. And what Spring MVC can do is it can look at a class. So we see the user.java class, and we see that it has a birth date field, a first name field, a last name field, a profile picture, and a user ID. Spring can take the parameter name, match it to the field name, and then insert those values into the fields of the class. And it's smart enough to recognize the data types of the fields in the class and perform type conversion. This is great because in the past, you'll probably see the code on the right used quite often. Here we're creating a new user object, and then we're looking at a request within the servlet's get method, and we're checking if the first name parameter exists, and if it does, then we're assigning it to the first name field on the user object. And we do this for every field, and it can be more complex. There can be lists, there can be arrays, and we have to do this sort of processing, and it's error prone. Maybe we type the wrong name for the parameter. Maybe we assign the value of the parameter to the wrong set method. All sorts of things can go wrong, and Spring is able to perform this data binding automatically for us. And it's also great because we can customize this data binding. It's smart enough to handle lists, to handle other collections, to handle arrays. It's really a time saver, and it takes some work off of our plate that is very error prone. Finally, I'd like to discuss a few other features of Spring MVC. Spring MVC provides a mechanism for validating user input and our model objects, so when data binding occurs, we can have different validation roles in place. And then if we encounter errors, it provides a consistent mechanism for reporting those errors to the user interface. It also provides us with some additional file upload support, so it really reduces the work we need to perform in order to allow a user to upload a file. It also has a tag library that really helps us out with data binding and tying our user interface data to form backing objects. And finally, Spring helps us display multiple views back to our user. It allows us to present the user with Excel, PDF, JSON, or other custom views that we build. Remember, this is separate because it's sitting in that view layer, so it's very easy to interchange the views you display. These are some of the great features of Spring MVC, and we will be looking further into these features throughout the course.